What happens when the money meant for soldiers is touched by the very people trusted to protect it? In Burkina Faso, that question is no longer theoretical. Under Captain Ibrahim Traore, the government has sent a message so sharp that every office, every uniform, and every financial desk should hear it clearly. Anyone who reaches for the money of the men defending the nation will pay a price. This is not just another corruption story. This is not just about 2 police officers losing their jobs. This is about a government drawing a red line around the resources meant for those standing on the front line, facing danger while others sleep safely at home. More than 45 million CFA, equal to roughly $80,000, was reportedly diverted from funds meant to support security operations. That money was not sitting there for luxury. It was not meant for private pockets. It was supposed to help keep units functioning, keep operations moving, and support the men who carry the burden of protecting Burkina Faso. And now, the Traore government is saying enough is enough. The 2 officers were not only dismissed, the door remains open for legal action, asset seizure, and deeper investigations into the financial chain. That is the part that should make every corrupt official nervous. Because this is no longer about public speeches. This is about consequences. For years, many African nations have suffered from a painful pattern. Money is approved for soldiers, schools, roads, hospitals, or farmers. But somewhere between the top office and the people who need it, that money disappears. The people suffer. The nation becomes weaker, and those responsible often walk away untouched. But Burkina Faso is trying to write a different chapter. If you believe Africa deserves honest leadership and real accountability, stay with this channel, because stories like this show us where the continent may be heading next. Today, we will look at why this case matters, why Captain Ibrahim Traore treats soldiers' money as a sacred line, and why this could be the beginning of a much larger purge inside the system. Because when a nation is fighting for survival, corruption is not just theft. It is betrayal. The announcement came without warning, but its impact echoed across government offices, police barracks, and military installations throughout Burkina Faso. During the Council of Ministers meeting held on June 18, 2026, authorities confirmed that 2 police officers had been dismissed after investigators uncovered the embezzlement of more than 45 million CFA, approximately $80,000, from funds intended for the Mobile Intervention Unit of the National Police. The names of the officers were made public, along with their positions. One served as the head of administration and finance, while the other was responsible for logistics. These were not junior employees making accounting mistakes. They occupied positions of trust, managing resources that should have reached security personnel carrying out dangerous assignments in one of the country's most challenging regions. According to the government's findings, the money had been allocated to support operational activities for officers deployed in the field. These funds were intended to cover essential expenses linked to security missions, including operational allowances and logistical support. Every franc represented resources that frontline personnel depended on while protecting communities threatened by armed extremist groups. What made this announcement extraordinary was not simply the dismissal itself. Governments around the world remove officials for misconduct every year. What immediately caught public attention was the clear warning attached to the decision. The dismissals would not replace criminal responsibility. Legal proceedings could continue, and authorities announced that assets could be seized up to the value of the money that had allegedly been stolen. That statement transformed the story from a routine disciplinary case into a national message. Burkina Faso was telling every official responsible for managing public money that losing a government position would no longer be the only consequence. If public funds disappeared, personal wealth could also come under investigation. The government went even further by emphasizing that this case should serve as a warning to everyone involved in the financial chain. Accountants, logistics officers, financial managers, and administrators were all reminded that money intended for soldiers and security personnel would receive the highest level of protection. No title, no rank, and no position would automatically shield anyone from investigation if evidence of wrongdoing emerged. For many citizens, that message carried enormous symbolic weight. Corruption often survives because people believe powerful individuals are protected by their positions. When investigations stop at lower levels, public confidence slowly disappears. By publicly identifying senior officers within the security structure, the authorities sought to demonstrate that accountability would extend beyond ordinary employees. Whether this approach succeeds over the long term will depend on consistent enforcement and respect for due process. Yet, one fact is already clear. Captain Ibrahim Traore's administration is attempting to redefine the relationship between public office and public responsibility. Instead of treating corruption as an unfortunate administrative problem, it is presenting it as a direct threat to national security and to the men and women risking their lives on Burkina Faso's front lines. Money has always been one of the greatest weapons in war. Even when no bullets are being fired, armies may rely on courage, discipline, and training. But none of those qualities can replace food, fuel, medical supplies, transportation, or operational support. Every military commander understands one simple truth. A soldier cannot defend a nation if the system behind him is quietly stealing the resources meant to keep him alive. That is why this corruption case carries far greater importance than the amount of money involved. The 45 million CFA, approximately $80,000, represents much more than figures in a government report. It represents trust. It represents responsibility. Most importantly, it represents the promise a nation makes to the men and women who risk everything on its behalf. Captain Ibrahim Traore appears to understand this principle better than most. Since assuming leadership, he has repeatedly emphasized that Burkina Faso's survival depends not only on military operations, but also on disciplined management of national resources. Fighting armed extremist groups requires more than brave soldiers. It requires an efficient financial system capable of ensuring that every approved resource actually reaches the people who need it. Imagine standing at a remote security post hundreds of miles from your family. Every day carries uncertainty. Supplies arrive through difficult routes. Communication may be limited. Under those conditions, operational allowances and logistical support become far more than simple financial benefits. They become part of the system that allows soldiers to continue performing their duties despite enormous hardship. Now imagine discovering that someone sitting safely behind a desk has diverted part of those resources for personal gain. The financial loss would certainly matter, but the emotional damage could be even greater. Confidence inside the institution begins to disappear. Soldiers start questioning whether the sacrifices demanded of them are truly respected by those managing the system. This is precisely why many military organizations around the world treat corruption involving operational funds as one of the most serious internal offenses. It weakens readiness without firing a single shot. It creates distrust without an enemy crossing the border. In many cases, it damages morale more effectively than hostile propaganda ever could. By acting publicly in this case, the government appears determined to communicate that the money allocated for national defense belongs first to the mission, not to individuals responsible for administering it. The message extends far beyond two dismissed officers. It reaches every accountant, logistics manager, procurement officer, and administrator handling public funds. The expectation is becoming increasingly clear. Every franc intended for those protecting Burkina Faso must arrive exactly where it was meant to go. For Captain Ibrahim Traore, protecting soldiers' money is not simply an accounting exercise. It is presented as an essential part of protecting national sovereignty itself. If the country hopes to strengthen its security forces, restore public confidence, and build a more resilient state, then safeguarding every resource dedicated to the front lines becomes more than financial discipline. It becomes an act of national defense. The dismissal of 2 police officers may have captured the headlines, but the most significant development happened quietly behind the scenes. Instead of treating corruption as an isolated crime committed by a few dishonest individuals, the government began changing the system that made such abuses possible in the first place. For decades, anti-corruption campaigns in many countries have often followed the same pattern. An official is arrested. Public outrage grows for a few days. Promises of reform are made. And eventually, another scandal emerges because the underlying weaknesses remain untouched. Captain Ibrahim Traore's administration appears determined to avoid repeating that cycle by focusing not only on punishment, but also on prevention. One of the government's first decisions was to modify how operational allowances would be distributed, rather than relying on traditional administrative channels that could create opportunities for diversion. Payments are now being directed through the military and paramilitary savings and credit cooperative. While this change may sound technical, its purpose is straightforward. The fewer unnecessary layers that exist between government funds and the people entitled to receive them, the fewer opportunities exist for those funds to disappear. The reform does not stop with changing payment methods. Authorities also announced that financial inspections would continue across the entire chain of responsibility. Every office involved in budgeting, accounting, logistics, procurement, and financial management could become subject to closer examination. This approach recognizes an important reality. Corruption rarely succeeds because of one individual acting alone. It often survives through weak procedures, poor oversight, and systems that fail to detect irregularities before serious damage occurs. Another important element of the government's strategy involves recovering public assets whenever possible. Officials emphasized that dismissal alone does not erase legal responsibility. If investigations determine that public funds were illegally taken, authorities may seek to seize assets equivalent to the value of the losses. This sends a powerful message. Corruption should not become a profitable gamble, where the only risk is losing a government position while keeping the financial rewards. Perhaps the most meaningful aspect of these reforms is the effort to combine administrative discipline with structural modernization. Around the same period, Burkina Faso introduced measures to simplify construction permits, expand digital processing, and establish one-stop administrative services. Although these reforms involve different sectors, they share a common philosophy. Complex bureaucratic systems often create opportunities for abuse. Simplifying procedures, increasing transparency, and reducing unnecessary intermediaries can help limit those opportunities before corruption takes root. For Captain Ibrahim Traore, the objective appears larger than exposing individual wrongdoing. The broader goal is to build institutions capable of protecting public resources regardless of who occupies a particular office. Lasting reform does not depend on catching every dishonest official. It depends on creating systems where corruption becomes increasingly difficult to hide, increasingly difficult to repeat, and increasingly costly for anyone willing to take the risk. If these reforms continue to be implemented consistently and fairly, Burkina Faso may ultimately be remembered not only for punishing corruption, but for redesigning the institutions that allowed corruption to flourish in the first place. Captain Ibrahim Traore has become one of the most closely watched leaders on the African continent, not only because of his speeches or his military background, but because of the political message he is trying to send through actions like this. To many supporters, the dismissal of 2 police officers is not an isolated disciplinary measure. It represents another piece of a much broader effort to redefine how government should function in Burkina Faso. For decades, many African citizens have expressed frustration with a familiar pattern. Leaders frequently promised to fight corruption during election campaigns or national addresses, yet ordinary people often saw little change. Investigations would begin, headlines would dominate the news for a few weeks, and eventually public attention would fade while old habits returned. That cycle gradually weakened confidence in public institutions across much of the continent. Traore appears determined to break that cycle by demonstrating that accountability must begin inside the state itself. In this case, the individuals under investigation were not political opponents or private business figures. They were members of the country's own security structure. By allowing disciplinary measures and possible legal proceedings to move forward, his administration is attempting to show that public office does not guarantee immunity from responsibility. This approach also strengthens an important principle within military organizations. Discipline cannot exist only on the battlefield. It must also exist in offices where budgets are approved, supplies are managed, and operational funds are distributed. A nation asking young men and women to risk their lives cannot afford financial indiscipline among those responsible for supporting them from behind the front lines. Many supporters, therefore, see Traore's anti-corruption campaign as part of a larger vision of national renewal. They argue that sovereignty is not achieved simply by controlling borders or reducing foreign dependence. True sovereignty also requires protecting national resources from internal abuse. Every dollar recovered from corruption is viewed as money that can instead strengthen public services, improve security, or support long-term development. At the same time, it is important to recognize that lasting success cannot be measured by a single high-profile case. Sustainable reform depends on consistent investigations, transparent legal procedures, equal treatment under the law, and institutions capable of enforcing accountability regardless of rank or political influence. Those principles will ultimately determine whether today's actions become lasting reforms or temporary headlines. Even so, this case has already delivered one unmistakable message. Captain Ibrahim Traore wants every official handling public funds to understand that responsibility now carries real consequences. The uniform someone wears, the office they occupy, or the authority they possess will not automatically protect them if they betray the trust placed in them. For many people across Africa, that message extends beyond Burkina Faso. It represents the possibility that leadership can be measured not only by promises of change, but by the willingness to confront corruption inside one's own government before pointing fingers elsewhere. No discussion about Captain Ibrahim Traore would be complete without acknowledging that his leadership continues to generate strong reactions far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. While many supporters across Africa praise his determination to confront corruption and strengthen national sovereignty, several Western governments, international organizations, and human rights groups have expressed concerns about the direction of the country's political transition and its broader governance. Some critics argue that Burkina Faso's military-led government raises important questions about democratic institutions, civil liberties, and the timetable for returning to civilian rule. Others have voiced concerns regarding press freedom, political participation, and allegations of human rights violations committed during counterterrorism operations, These issues continue to receive significant attention in international media and remain part of the broader debate surrounding the country's future. Those concerns deserve to be acknowledged, because lasting stability depends not only on security but also on respect for the rule of law and accountable institutions. At the same time, many citizens inside Burkina Faso view the situation through a different lens. For communities living under the constant threat of violent extremist attacks, immediate security and the ability of the state to function effectively often become urgent priorities alongside political reform. This difference in perspective helps explain why anti-corruption measures such as the dismissal of officials accused of stealing military funds receive considerable domestic support. From the viewpoint of many Burkinabe citizens, protecting money allocated to frontline security forces is not simply a financial issue. It is directly connected to the country's ability to defend villages, maintain public order, and preserve national sovereignty during an ongoing security crisis. The recent reforms therefore illustrate a broader principle that extends beyond Burkina Faso. Fighting corruption requires more than speeches, arrests, or symbolic investigations. It requires governments willing to redesign financial systems, increase transparency, strengthen independent oversight, and ensure that public resources reach their intended purpose. Without those structural changes, corruption often returns regardless of who occupies the highest office. There is also an important lesson here for other African nations. Sustainable development cannot be built on institutions where public funds disappear before reaching schools, hospitals, infrastructure projects, or security forces. Every country must develop accountability mechanisms suited to its own constitutional framework, legal traditions, and national circumstances. The methods may differ, but the objective remains the same: protecting public resources for the public good. Ultimately, the debate surrounding Captain Ibrahim Traore reflects a larger conversation taking place across Africa. Can governments simultaneously strengthen national sovereignty, improve security, combat corruption, and build stronger public institutions? The answer will not be determined by speeches alone. It will depend on measurable results, transparent governance, equal application of the law, and the trust earned from ordinary citizens over time. Regardless of where observers stand politically, one reality is difficult to ignore. The decision to pursue officials accused of diverting funds intended for frontline personnel has transformed a single corruption case into a wider discussion about leadership, accountability, and the future direction of governance not only in Burkina Faso, but across the African continent. As this story comes to a close, one important question remains. Years from now, how will this moment be remembered? Will it simply be another corruption scandal that briefly captured headlines before fading into history? Or will it be remembered as the moment Burkina Faso began transforming the way public service, military discipline, and financial accountability work together? The answer will not depend on one speech, one investigation, or one dismissal. It will depend on whether the reforms announced today continue tomorrow, next year, and for many years to come. Lasting change is never created by a single leader acting alone. It is built when institutions become stronger than individuals, and when accountability becomes a permanent expectation instead of a temporary campaign. Captain Ibrahim Traore has repeatedly presented the fight against corruption as part of a broader effort to rebuild national confidence. From restructuring financial oversight to simplifying administrative procedures and strengthening accountability, his administration appears determined to convince citizens that public office is a responsibility rather than a privilege. Whether history ultimately judges these reforms as fully successful will depend on consistent implementation, transparency, and equal application of the law to everyone, regardless of rank or influence. For the soldiers standing on remote front lines, however, the issue is far more immediate. They do not measure success by political debates or international headlines. They measure it by whether their equipment arrives on time, whether their operational support is available when needed, and whether the promises made by their government are honored. Protecting the resources allocated to those men and women is therefore about much more than accounting. It is about honoring sacrifice. There is also a lesson that extends well beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. Many African nations continue to struggle with corruption that quietly drains resources intended for development. Education, healthcare, infrastructure, and national security. Every dollar lost to corruption is a dollar that cannot build a school, equip a hospital, repair a road, or protect a community. Every reform that strengthens transparency brings nations one step closer to long-term stability and prosperity. Whether one fully agrees with Captain Ibrahim Traore or not, this case reminds us that genuine leadership is tested not only by promises, but by difficult decisions. Investigating officials inside one's own government requires political will. Restructuring financial systems requires persistence. Building public trust requires years of consistent action. Perhaps that is why this story has attracted attention across Africa and beyond. It speaks to a question many societies continue asking themselves. Can governments truly place national interest above personal gain? Can public institutions earn back the confidence of ordinary citizens? Can accountability become stronger than corruption? Only time will provide the final answer. But for now, Burkina Faso has sent a message that many people across the continent are watching closely. The message is that public money belongs to the public, and the resources intended for those defending the nation must never become private wealth. As supporters of Pan-African ideals continue discussing the future of the continent, Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traore, the vision of Pan-Africanism, the role of the African Union, and the broader conversation about Africa New will remain part of that debate. Ibrahim Traore's reforms will ultimately be judged by their results, but they have already challenged many long-held assumptions about governance, accountability, and national responsibility. If you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe to the channel and join us for more in-depth discussions about the people, policies, and events shaping the future of Africa. Thank you for watching. Stay safe. And may wisdom guide every nation seeking a stronger and more transparent future. What if one of Africa's poorest nations stopped waiting for foreign investors, international lenders, and multinational corporations to shape its future? What if ordinary citizens became the owners of the factories, farms, and industries that power their economy? That is exactly the experiment unfolding in Burkina Faso under Captain Ibrahim Traore. While many African countries continue to rely heavily on foreign capital to finance development, Burkina Faso is attempting something far more ambitious. Through a program known as popular shareholding, hundreds of thousands of citizens are being invited to become direct stakeholders in national economic projects. For decades, Africa has faced a painful contradiction. The continent possesses enormous natural wealth, yet many countries remain dependent on exporting raw materials while importing finished products at higher prices. Burkina Faso has not escaped this reality. The country produces agricultural goods, livestock, and gold. Yet much of the value generated from those resources has historically left the country. Traore's response is built around a simple but powerful question. If Burkina Faso has resources, workers, farmers, and entrepreneurs, why should it always wait for outsiders to finance its development? This question challenges one of the most common assumptions about economic growth in Africa. Rather than asking who will invest in Burkina Faso, the government is asking how Burkinabe citizens can invest in themselves. The goal is not only to raise money, it is to transform the role of citizens within the economy. Instead of remaining consumers, taxpayers, and workers, they are encouraged to become shareholders and co-owners of national development projects. If you enjoy exploring bold economic ideas that could reshape Africa's future, make sure to subscribe and join us for more stories like this. Popular shareholding did not appear out of nowhere. Although many international observers describe it as a new economic experiment, its roots reach deep into African traditions and Burkina Faso's own history. For generations, communities across West Africa survived through collective effort. Families worked shared fields, cared for communal livestock, and contributed labor to projects that benefited everyone. Wealth was often understood not only as an individual achievement, but also as a collective responsibility. The success of one household strengthened the entire community. Supporters of popular shareholding argue that Ibrahim Traore is adapting this traditional spirit to the modern economy. Instead of asking villagers to work together on a communal farm, the model encourages citizens to pool financial resources and become shareholders in enterprises that serve national development goals. The intellectual foundation of this idea is also linked to long-standing debates about African economic independence. Thinkers such as Laurent Gbagbo promoted the concept of community entrepreneurship as a way to mobilize local resources rather than relying exclusively on external funding. Their argument was simple: a nation that cannot finance its own productive sectors will struggle to control its own future. Many observers also see echoes of the philosophy associated with Thomas Sankara. During the 1980s, Sankara emphasized self-reliance, local production, and dignity through work. While the economic tools are different today, the underlying message remains familiar. Development should begin with the people themselves. What makes Traore's approach unique is the attempt to transform a cultural value into a modern financial mechanism. Citizens are not simply encouraged to support development in theory. They are invited to participate directly through ownership. This distinction matters. A factory funded by community shareholders is viewed differently from one financed entirely by foreign investors. For supporters, it creates a stronger connection between economic growth and national responsibility. The project becomes more than a business venture. It becomes a symbol of collective ambition and shared destiny. At first glance, many people compare Ibrahim Traore's economic vision to the model that helped transform Norway into one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Both approaches begin with a similar principle. National resources should benefit the population rather than a small elite or foreign interests. Norway used revenues from its oil and gas sector to build a massive national wealth fund. The state collected and managed those resources on behalf of the population, creating long-term financial security for future generations. It is often presented as one of the most successful examples of resource management in modern history. Burkina Faso shares the same desire for economic sovereignty, but Traore is attempting something fundamentally different. Instead of relying primarily on the state to manage wealth for citizens, he is encouraging citizens to become direct participants in the creation of that wealth. This distinction may seem subtle, but it changes the entire relationship between people and the economy. In the traditional model, citizens benefit indirectly through public services, infrastructure, and government spending. In the Burkinabe model, citizens are invited to become shareholders in projects that seek to generate economic value. Supporters argue that this approach goes beyond ownership on paper. It creates a sense of responsibility and engagement. When people own a stake in a factory, an agricultural project, or a mining enterprise, they may feel a stronger interest in its success. Traore's innovation lies in combining modern investment mechanisms with a community-centered culture. Rather than copying a European model, he has adapted the principle of shared prosperity to local realities. The goal is not merely to distribute wealth after it is created. The goal is to involve citizens in creating that wealth from the beginning. For this reason, many observers believe Burkina Faso is not building a version of Norway. It is attempting to create something uniquely African, shaped by its own history, traditions, and development challenges. Turning an idea into reality required more than speeches and patriotic slogans. To make popular shareholding work, Burkina Faso needed an institution capable of organizing investments, managing subscriptions, and connecting citizens to national development projects. That institution became the Agency for the Promotion of Community Entrepreneurship, widely known as APEC. Created in 2023, APEC was designed to provide the legal and operational framework for community-owned enterprises. Its mission is straightforward but ambitious. It seeks to mobilize domestic savings, identify productive projects, and channel citizen investments into sectors considered essential for national development. One of the most remarkable aspects of the program is its accessibility. Participation is not reserved for wealthy investors or large corporations. Farmers, workers, retirees, small business owners, students, and members of the diaspora can all become shareholders. This broad participation is central to the philosophy behind the initiative. Economic transformation should involve the population as a whole, rather than a limited group of elites. The response has been significant. Hundreds of thousands of Burkinabe citizens have joined the program, while billions of CFA francs have been mobilized to support community enterprises. These figures suggest that many people are willing to contribute financially when they believe they have a direct stake in the outcome. The participation of the diaspora has also played an important role. Burkinabe citizens living abroad are encouraged to invest in projects from their countries of residence, allowing them to contribute to development without returning home permanently. For supporters, the success of APEC is measured by more than the money collected. It represents a shift in mentality. Citizens are no longer viewed simply as beneficiaries of development programs. They are becoming partners in the process. Whether this model ultimately succeeds or fails, it has already changed the conversation about who should finance the future of Burkina Faso. The true test of any economic vision is not the number of speeches delivered or the amount of money collected. The real test is whether tangible results appear on the ground. In Burkina Faso, supporters of popular shareholding point to a growing list of projects that aim to prove the model can move from theory to reality. One of the most visible examples is the development of tomato processing facilities. For years, Burkina Faso produced large quantities of tomatoes, yet the country still depended heavily on imported tomato products. This situation reflected a broader challenge faced by many African economies. Raw materials were produced locally, but much of the value-added processing occurred elsewhere. The new factories seek to change that equation. Instead of exporting agricultural products in their raw form, Burkina Faso aims to process more of them domestically. Supporters believe this approach can create jobs, strengthen local industries, and reduce dependence on imported goods. Agriculture is not the only target. The broader program also includes agricultural mechanization initiatives, centralized purchasing systems for agricultural products, and semi-mechanized mining projects. Each project is designed around the same principle. Resources generated within the country should contribute more directly to national prosperity. The expected benefits extend beyond production figures. New industries can create employment opportunities for young people, provide more stable markets for farmers, and encourage additional investment in local supply chains. Instead of exporting value, the country seeks to retain more of it within its borders. For many citizens, these projects represent something larger than economic development. They symbolize the possibility of transforming Burkina Faso from a supplier of raw materials into a producer of finished goods. Whether that transformation succeeds remains to be seen. But the ambition behind it is undeniable. It is an attempt to build industrial growth with the participation of the people themselves. Not everyone is convinced that popular shareholding will deliver the results its supporters expect. As the program gains attention, it has also attracted criticism from international observers, economists, and commentators who question whether such an ambitious experiment can succeed over the long term. One concern involves governance. Critics argue that collecting money from hundreds of thousands of citizens is only the beginning. The greater challenge is ensuring that projects are managed efficiently, transparently, and profitably. Without strong oversight, public trust could be damaged. Others point to financial risk. Any investment carries uncertainty, and not every factory, agricultural enterprise, or mining project will automatically become successful. Some observers worry that ordinary citizens could face disappointment if certain projects fail to meet expectations. Supporters of the initiative respond that risk exists in every development strategy. They argue that dependence on foreign loans, external aid, and imported products also carries significant risks. From this perspective, popular shareholding is not risk-free, but neither is the status quo. Another criticism is that community-owned enterprises may struggle to compete against large international corporations. Yet supporters note that many successful industrial nations protected and supported domestic industries during their early stages of development. Ultimately, the debate reflects two different visions of economic progress. One emphasizes integration into existing global financial structures. The other seeks to build stronger domestic ownership and control over productive sectors. Whether popular shareholding becomes a historic success or an important lesson remains uncertain. What is clear is that Burkina Faso has opened a conversation that extends far beyond its borders. The question is no longer whether Africans can participate in development. The question is whether they can become owners of it. Whether popular shareholding ultimately succeeds or fails will only be known years from now. Economic transformation is never measured in months. It is measured in generations. Yet even at this early stage, the experiment taking place in Burkina Faso has already captured attention across Africa because it challenges assumptions that many people considered unquestionable for decades. Development discussions often focused on attracting foreign investment, securing international loans, and obtaining external assistance. Ibrahim Traore has not rejected cooperation with the outside world, but he has placed a different question at the center of the conversation. What happens when citizens themselves become investors in national development? That question may prove to be the most important aspect of this entire project. Factories can be built, programs can change, governments can come and go, but a population that begins to see itself as an owner rather than a spectator may develop a completely different relationship with the economy. The broader lesson for Africa is not that every country should copy Burkina Faso's model exactly. Each nation has its own history, institutions, and challenges. The lesson is that development becomes more powerful when people feel personally connected to it. Citizens are more likely to support economic transformation when they believe they share both the responsibility and the rewards. Captain Ibrahim Traore is attempting to turn that idea into reality by linking ownership, participation, and industrial development. He is testing a model that many countries have discussed but few have attempted on such a scale. History will determine whether this vision fulfills its promise. Yet, one fact is already clear. Burkina Faso has launched one of the most closely watched economic experiments in modern Africa. For supporters of Pan-African development, Africa New Thinking, Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traore, the African Union, Pan-Africanism, and Ibrahim Traore's vision of economic sovereignty. The outcome could influence debates across the continent for years to come. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts below. Your perspective may be part of the conversation shaping Africa's future. There comes a moment in the life of a nation when the world suddenly realizes that the country it once dismissed has stopped asking for permission to survive. For decades, Burkina Faso was treated as another fragile African state trapped between poverty, foreign debt, and endless dependency. The global financial system expected Ouagadougou to remain in the same position forever, weak enough to obey, poor enough to depend, desperate enough to accept whatever conditions arrived attached to foreign money. But something has changed. Today, the World Bank is expanding more than 27 projects across Burkina Faso, with total commitments approaching $4.18 billion. That number alone is enough to make global financial observers pay attention. But the real story is not the money. The real story is how Captain Ibrahim Traore is using international financing in a way that completely breaks the old African script. This is not the Burkina Faso of yesterday. This is a nation trying to transform foreign capital into national independence instead of permanent dependence. Traore is not standing before the world with his hands stretched out, begging for survival. He is negotiating from a position built on sovereignty, control, and long-term national ambition. And that is exactly why the conversation around Burkina Faso has become so uncomfortable for parts of the West. If you believe Africa deserves the right to shape its own destiny, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because today we are diving into one of the most important political and economic transformations happening anywhere in the Pan-African world right now. For years, Burkina Faso existed inside a system that many Africans quietly believed was designed to keep countries weak. For generations, the people of Burkina Faso watched their country export gold, cotton, and raw materials while importing debt, dependency, and economic humiliation. Foreign corporations entered the country with promises of development, but too often the wealth extracted from Burkinabe soil disappeared into offshore accounts and foreign markets long before ordinary citizens ever saw the benefits. This was the old cycle that trapped much of Africa for decades. Governments borrowed heavily from international institutions. Conditions followed every loan. State industries were weakened. Strategic sectors were opened to outside control. Public services struggled, while debt payments continued rising year after year. Burkina Faso became known internationally as a country surviving on aid, instead of a nation capable of building its own future. Many young people lost faith completely. Some dreamed only of leaving the country. Others believed real economic power could never belong to African nations because the global system had already been designed against them. Then Ibrahim Traore arrived and changed the national mood almost overnight. What made Traore different was not simply his speeches against dependency. Africa has heard speeches before. The difference was the tone. He spoke less like a politician asking the world for sympathy, and more like a leader announcing that Burkina Faso intended to renegotiate its place inside the international system. Under his leadership, the language coming from Ouagadougou began to shift. Burkina Faso would still cooperate with international institutions, but cooperation would no longer mean surrender. Foreign investment would be accepted, But national sovereignty would come first. The country would no longer define success by how much aid it received, but by how much control it regained over its own future. That psychological transformation may be the most important change of all, because nations do not become independent the moment money arrives. They become independent the moment they stop believing dependency is permanent. The reason the World Bank continues expanding its presence inside Burkina Faso is not because the country suddenly became politically convenient. In many ways, Burkina Faso has become far more unpredictable for the traditional global order. Yet, despite growing tensions with parts of the West, the World Bank now maintains more than 27 active projects in the country with commitments approaching $4.18 billion. That reality tells us something extremely important. Burkina Faso is no longer being treated as a passive aid recipient. It has become strategically impossible to ignore. The projects currently financed by the World Bank touch nearly every critical area of national development: energy infrastructure, agriculture, education, healthcare, transportation, and social services are all receiving major support. Even more significant, Burkina Faso has managed to maintain a disbursement rate higher than the regional average despite serious security and political challenges. Under ordinary circumstances, international financial institutions become cautious when a country adopts strong nationalist policies or openly criticizes dependency on foreign powers. But Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traore, has forced a different calculation. The Sahel region has become one of the most geopolitically sensitive regions in the world. Western influence is weakening. French military presence has collapsed across several countries. Anti-colonial sentiment is rising among younger African populations. And in the middle of all these changes, Burkina Faso is trying to build a model that combines international financing with stronger national control. The World Bank understands the stakes. If it completely loses influence in Ouagadougou, it risks losing influence across a much wider section of West Africa. That is why cooperation continues even while political tensions grow louder. In many ways, both sides now need each other for very different reasons. Burkina Faso needs financing to modernize its economy. But international institutions also need continued access to a country that may shape the future direction of the entire Sahel region. What truly separates Ibrahim Traore from many leaders before him is not that he rejects international money. It is that he refuses to allow international money to define the future of Burkina Faso. For decades, many African economies operated under a familiar pattern. Governments borrowed billions of dollars, but the structure of those economies barely changed. Roads were built, conferences were held, consultants were paid, and foreign contractors secured enormous profits while local production remained weak. Countries consumed more than they produced and imported more than they manufactured. Traore appears determined to break that cycle. The current strategy emerging from Ouagadougou is centered on using international financing to strengthen domestic capacity instead of deepening foreign dependency. Investments are increasingly directed toward sectors that can help Burkina Faso stand on its own feet in the future. Energy projects are expanding because no country can industrialize in permanent darkness. Agricultural investment is growing because food dependency creates political vulnerability. Technical education and vocational training are being emphasized because nations cannot develop without skilled local workers. Even more important is the growing focus on national control over strategic sectors. Burkina Faso is trying to reduce the old model where raw resources leave Africa cheaply while finished products return at much higher prices. Gold, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and state-linked industries are all becoming part of a broader conversation about economic sovereignty. This is why the message coming from Traore resonates so strongly across the continent. He is not saying that Africa should isolate itself from the world. He is saying Africa must stop entering global partnerships from a position of permanent weakness. Burkina Faso still needs foreign financing, technology, and international trade. But the leadership in Ouagadougou increasingly wants those relationships to operate on different terms. The goal is no longer survival through dependency. The goal is development through controlled cooperation. And for parts of the old international system, that shift is deeply unsettling. What truly worries parts of the Western political and financial establishment is not simply the money flowing into Burkina Faso. $4.18 billion is significant, but global institutions manage far larger amounts every year. The real concern is the example Burkina Faso may create if this strategy succeeds. Because if a country facing insecurity, poverty, and international pressure can still begin rebuilding national control over its economy, then millions of Africans across the continent will start asking dangerous questions. Why should resource-rich nations remain permanently dependent on foreign expertise? Why should countries exporting gold continue importing poverty? Why should governments surrender control over strategic industries simply to qualify for loans? That is the deeper ideological battle now emerging around Burkina Faso. Critics in the West frequently point to concerns about democracy, media restrictions, and political freedoms under military leadership. Some of those concerns are legitimate. Burkina Faso still faces serious security problems, humanitarian challenges, and governance risks. No honest analysis should ignore those realities. But many Africans also notice something else. The loudest international criticism often seems to intensify whenever African governments begin reclaiming stronger control over natural resources or reducing foreign influence over national policy. That contradiction has fueled growing skepticism across the continent. People are beginning to ask whether some international outrage is truly about protecting democracy, or whether part of it is about protecting economic influence built during decades of unequal relationships. At the same time, Burkina Faso itself carries enormous responsibility. If the government wants to convince Africa that a new path is possible, then it must prove that sovereignty produces real results for ordinary citizens. Roads must improve, electricity must expand, jobs must grow, corruption must decline. Otherwise, the promise of economic liberation could become just another political slogan. The stakes are now far bigger than Burkina Faso alone. What happens in Ouagadougou may influence how an entire generation of Africans thinks about development, power, and independence. The rise of Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traore carries lessons that extend far beyond one country or one political moment. Across Africa, governments are now watching closely to see whether Ouagadougou can transform bold rhetoric into lasting economic reality. The first lesson is that international financing does not automatically destroy sovereignty. The real issue is how that financing is negotiated and where the money ultimately goes. If loans only increase imports and dependency, countries remain trapped. But if investment strengthens electricity, agriculture, transportation, education, and domestic industry, then outside financing can become a tool for national development rather than permanent control. The second lesson is that resources alone are never enough. Africa has always possessed enormous wealth beneath its soil. What many countries lacked was the political courage and strategic planning required to convert raw materials into national power. Burkina Faso is now trying to use its gold, labor, and infrastructure projects to build stronger internal capacity instead of feeding external systems. The third lesson is that Pan-Africanism must become practical instead of symbolic. Citizens cannot eat speeches. They cannot power hospitals with slogans. A truly independent Africa requires factories, engineers, energy systems, schools, medicines, and functioning institutions that improve everyday life. Traore has changed the conversation because he speaks about sovereignty not only as political freedom, but as economic control. Still, the future remains uncertain. Burkina Faso must prove that discipline, transparency, and competent governance can sustain this new direction over time. If it succeeds, the impact could reach far beyond the borders of the Sahel. And if it fails, critics will argue that dependency was unavoidable all along. Burkina Faso is still far from perfect. The country continues to battle insecurity, economic pressure, and enormous development challenges. But something historic is unfolding in Ouagadougou that the rest of the world can no longer ignore. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso is attempting to engage with global financial institutions without surrendering the right to define its own future. The nearly $4.18 billion connected to World Bank projects no longer symbolizes automatic dependency in the eyes of many supporters of Captain Ibrahim Traore. Instead, it has become a test of whether Africa can use international systems without becoming trapped inside them. That is why this moment matters so deeply across the continent. Ibrahim Traore has forced a new conversation inside the Pan-African movement. He has challenged the old assumption that African nations must permanently choose between isolation or submission. Burkina Faso is trying to prove that another path may exist, a path where cooperation serves sovereignty instead of replacing it. Whether this experiment succeeds or fails will shape far more than one nation. It could influence how the African Union, future Pan-Africanism movements, and an entire Africa new generation think about development for decades to come. The world is watching Burkina Faso because the country now represents more than a small Sahel state. It represents a growing demand for dignity, ownership, and self-determination. Captain Ibrahim Traore did not simply inherit a crisis. He stepped into a system many Africans believed was designed to keep them permanently dependent. Now, he is trying to rebuild that system from the inside out. And perhaps that is what truly unsettles the old powers most of all. Because once people begin believing they can control their own destiny, it becomes almost impossible to force them back onto their knees. If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe for more deep discussions on Burkina Faso, Pan-African change, and the future of Africa. Imagine a country that produces gold year after year, yet still has villages waiting for reliable electricity, roads that break under the first heavy rains, farmers who cannot move their harvest easily, and young people searching for work while the wealth beneath their feet is shipped away. For decades, this has been one of the great tragedies of Africa. The continent has carried gold, oil, uranium, copper, diamonds, and rare minerals, but too often, the deepest value has left the land before it could build the nation. Burkina Faso is now trying to change that story. On May 21st, the government adopted a decree creating a national mining sovereign fund, known as Sinian Sigui. This is not just another government account. It is designed to capture the extra revenue created when gold and other minerals rise above a reference price, then direct that money toward major national investments. In simple terms, when the mines earn more because global prices are higher, part of that surplus will no longer disappear into short-term spending or foreign profit. It will be reserved for roads, factories, electricity, water systems, industrial projects, and the foundations of a stronger economy. This is why the decision matters. Burkina Faso is not only asking how much gold can be extracted, It is asking a deeper question. How can gold become a road? How can minerals become jobs? How can the wealth of the soil become sovereignty for the people? Under Captain Ibrahim Traore, this policy fits a larger vision, a Burkina Faso that does not reject the world, but refuses to remain a supplier of raw wealth while others build industries from it. In this video, we will examine how this fund works, why it alarms some Western observers, and what lesson it may offer to other African nations. If you care about Africa's fight for dignity, independence, and economic power, stay with this channel as we follow that historic turning point. For many years, Burkina Faso stood among Africa's leading gold producers. Every year, millions of dollars worth of gold left the country for international markets. On paper, this should have been a story of prosperity. Yet for many Burkinabe families, daily life changed far more slowly than the impressive export figures suggested. This contradiction is not unique to Burkina Faso. Economists often describe it as the resource paradox. A country may possess enormous natural wealth while still struggling with limited infrastructure, industrial development, and employment opportunities. Minerals generate impressive revenues, but if most of the value is created elsewhere, the producing nation captures only a fraction of the long-term benefits. For decades, Burkina Faso largely exported raw gold, while much of the refining, financing, trading, and manufacturing linked to that gold occurred outside its borders. International companies invested capital and expertise, helping expand production, but significant portions of the profits, advanced technology, and downstream industries remained concentrated abroad. The country earned taxes and royalties, yet many citizens continued to ask why abundant mineral resources had not translated into broader economic transformation. The government now argues that the issue has never been whether foreign investment should exist. Rather, the question is whether Burkina Faso should continue relying on a model where its greatest natural wealth primarily supports industrial growth elsewhere, instead of strengthening its own economy. This debate has become even more important as global gold prices have reached historically strong levels. Higher prices create additional revenues that were often unpredictable and temporary. Without a dedicated mechanism, these windfalls could easily disappear into routine government spending without creating lasting national assets. The leadership believes this moment offers a rare opportunity to rethink the country's economic future. Instead of measuring success only by the number of ounces exported each year, Burkina Faso is beginning to measure success by the factories it can build, the roads it can pave, the electricity it can generate, and the industries it can establish using the wealth created beneath its own soil. This shift represents the foundation upon which every subsequent mining reform is being built. The creation of the National Mining Sovereign Fund represents far more than a financial reform. It introduces an entirely different philosophy for managing mineral wealth. Instead of treating periods of high commodity prices as opportunities for immediate spending, Burkina Faso wants to transform temporary mining windfalls into permanent national assets. The mechanism behind the fund is surprisingly straightforward. Every year, the government establishes a reference price for strategic minerals such as gold, while preparing its national budget. This benchmark reflects a prudent estimate rather than assuming that international prices will remain exceptionally high. If global market prices exceed that reference level, the additional public revenue generated from mining activities is separated from ordinary government finances and transferred into the sovereign fund. This approach serves two important purposes. First, it protects the national budget from becoming dependent on volatile commodity prices. Gold markets rise and fall, sometimes dramatically, and governments that spend every unexpected dollar immediately often face serious financial difficulties when prices decline. By saving surplus revenues during prosperous years, Burkina Faso hopes to build greater economic resilience. Second, the fund creates a dedicated source of long-term investment capital. Rather than financing routine administrative expenses, the accumulated resources are intended to support projects capable of generating economic growth for decades. Roads connecting production zones, reliable electricity for industries, modern water infrastructure, industrial facilities, and strategic manufacturing projects are expected to become the principal beneficiaries. Government officials have indicated that the first investments financed through the fund could begin as early as 2027. The objective is not simply to spend more money, but to spend it in ways that expand the country's productive capacity. Every successful infrastructure project financed by mining revenues has the potential to create additional businesses, attract new investment, improve transportation, reduce production costs, and generate employment far beyond the mining sector itself. In essence, Burkina Faso is attempting to convert fluctuations in global gold prices into a stable foundation for national development, ensuring that today's mineral wealth continues creating opportunities long after the ore itself has been extracted. A sovereign fund, however, is only valuable if it creates visible change in people's lives. A growing bank account alone does not transform a nation. Schools cannot be built with promises. Factories cannot operate on good intentions. And economic sovereignty cannot exist without the infrastructure that allows businesses and communities to thrive. This is precisely where Burkina Faso's new strategy begins to separate itself from the country's previous mining model. Rather than measuring success solely by export revenues, the government intends to measure success by the national assets that those revenues create. One of the highest priorities is transportation infrastructure. Better roads reduce the cost of moving agricultural products, industrial materials, and commercial goods across the country. Farmers gain easier access to markets, manufacturers receive supplies more efficiently, and regional trade becomes more competitive. Every kilometer of modern roadway extends the economic reach of local communities. Reliable electricity represents another cornerstone of the strategy. Mining operations already require significant energy, but broader industrial development depends on stable power supplies for factories, processing plants, workshops, and small businesses. Without electricity, industrialization remains limited, regardless of how many natural resources a country possesses. Water infrastructure is equally important. Modern industries, agriculture, and expanding urban populations all depend on secure water systems. Investments in reservoirs, treatment facilities, and distribution networks improve both public health and economic productivity while supporting future industrial growth. Perhaps the most ambitious objective is the expansion of domestic manufacturing. Instead of exporting raw minerals and importing expensive finished products, Burkina Faso hopes to gradually develop industries capable of processing more of its natural resources at home. Each additional stage of production retained inside the country creates new businesses, develops technical expertise, increases tax revenues, and generates higher-paying jobs. This strategy also produces a multiplier effect. Infrastructure, financed by mining revenues, supports sectors far beyond mining itself. Better roads strengthen agriculture. Reliable electricity encourages manufacturing. Industrial zones attract private investment. Improved logistics lower transportation costs throughout the economy. For Burkina Faso, the ultimate goal is not simply to extract more gold. It is to transform finite mineral wealth into permanent national capacity. ensuring that future generations inherit productive industries and modern infrastructure rather than exhausted minds alone. At the center of this transformation stands Captain Ibrahim Traore, whose economic vision has become closely associated with the idea that political independence means little without economic independence. Since assuming leadership, he has repeatedly argued that Burkina Faso must gain greater control over the wealth generated by its own natural resources if it hopes to secure lasting national development. For decades, many African countries exported valuable raw materials while importing refined products, industrial equipment, and manufactured goods at much higher prices. To Traore, this cycle has prevented mineral-rich nations from capturing the full value of their own resources. His response has not been to reject international cooperation, but to redefine the terms under which that cooperation takes place. This philosophy is reflected in several reforms introduced by his government. The National Mining Sovereign Fund is only one component of a broader strategy that also includes expanding the role of the state-owned mining company, encouraging greater participation by Burkinabe businesses, supporting domestic refining capacity, and strengthening local industrial supply chains. The objective is straightforward. Every additional stage of production completed inside Burkina Faso creates more skilled employment, generates additional tax revenue, develops technical expertise, and reduces dependence on foreign processing facilities. Instead of exporting opportunity alongside raw minerals, the government wants a larger share of economic activity to remain within national borders. Traore has also emphasized that financial sovereignty requires diversified domestic sources of investment. Alongside mining revenues, his administration has promoted initiatives such as diaspora investment instruments and broader public participation in national development. The underlying principle is that Burkina Faso should increasingly finance its own future using resources generated by its own economy. Supporters view this approach as an important step toward restoring economic dignity and strengthening national resilience. Critics caution that ambitious reforms must be matched by transparent governance, professional management, and efficient public investment to achieve their intended results. Ultimately, the long-term success of Ibrahim Traore's vision will not be judged by speeches or political symbolism. It will be measured by whether Burkina Faso succeeds in converting mineral wealth into modern industries, reliable infrastructure, sustainable employment, and higher living standards for future generations. Transforming mineral wealth does not end with collecting more revenue. The greater challenge is creating an economy that continues generating prosperity long after the minerals have been extracted. This is where Burkina Faso's strategy moves beyond mining itself and toward building an integrated industrial economy. For many years, one of the country's greatest limitations was that most of its gold left the country in an early stage of production. Once exported, refining, certification, trading, jewelry manufacturing, and many high-value industrial activities took place elsewhere. Each additional processing stage created jobs, technical knowledge, and business opportunities, but those benefits largely remained outside Burkina Faso. The government's new vision seeks to gradually reverse this pattern. Developing domestic gold refining capacity is expected to become one of the most significant milestones in this transformation. Refining gold within the country allows Burkina Faso to retain more value before export, while also strengthening technical expertise, regulatory oversight, and industrial capabilities. Beyond refining, officials also envision the growth of an entire industrial ecosystem connected to mining. Local engineering firms, equipment maintenance companies, transportation providers, construction businesses, environmental services, laboratories, and vocational training institutions all become part of a broader value chain. Instead of mining operating as an isolated sector, it begins supporting multiple areas of the national economy. This strategy places considerable emphasis on developing Burkinabe skills. Modern mining and mineral processing require engineers, geologists, electricians, mechanics, environmental specialists, machine operators, information technology professionals, and industrial managers. Expanding technical education, therefore, becomes an investment in the country's future productive capacity, rather than simply preparing workers for individual mining projects. A stronger domestic supply chain can also reduce dependence on imported services and equipment over time. As local businesses gain experience and competitiveness, a larger share of mining expenditures remains inside the national economy, creating additional income, tax revenue, and employment opportunities. The ultimate objective is clear. Gold should no longer represent only an export commodity. It should become the foundation for industrial development, technological progress, skilled employment, and a more diversified economy capable of creating prosperity long after the last ounce of ore has been mined from the ground. Policies become meaningful only when they produce measurable results. For Burkina Faso, the transition from vision to reality is beginning through a series of concrete initiatives designed to strengthen national control over the mining sector while laying the foundation for broader industrial development. One of the most significant developments has been the growing role of the state-owned mining company, SOPMIB. By increasing public participation in strategic mining assets, the government aims to ensure that a larger share of mining revenues remains available for national investment. This approach also provides greater influence over long-term planning and resource management, while encouraging stronger participation from Burkinabe businesses. At the same time, plans to expand domestic gold refining continue to represent a central pillar of the country's industrial ambitions. Instead of exporting nearly all gold in its raw or semi-processed form, Burkina Faso intends to retain additional stages of production within its own borders. Each new processing facility has the potential to generate skilled employment, strengthen technical expertise, and stimulate supporting industries that extend well beyond mining itself. The National Mining Sovereign Fund is expected to provide an important source of financing for many of these long-term priorities. Government officials have indicated that major infrastructure and industrial investments supported by the fund could begin from 2027 onward, while specific projects will be selected according to national priorities. The overall objective remains consistent: convert temporary mining income into permanent economic capacity. These investments could include transportation corridors that connect production regions with commercial centers, industrial zones capable of attracting manufacturing businesses, expanded electricity networks that support both communities and factories, and modern water infrastructure that benefits agriculture, industry, and urban development alike. Together, these initiatives demonstrate that the government's strategy extends far beyond increasing mineral production. The broader objective is to reshape the entire economic structure surrounding the mining sector. Success will ultimately depend on disciplined implementation, transparent governance, and efficient project management. If these conditions are achieved, Burkina Faso could gradually transform its mineral wealth into a lasting foundation for industrial growth. Stronger national institutions and greater economic resilience for future generations. As Burkina Faso advances its new mining strategy, it has also attracted growing international attention. Supporters describe the reforms as an important effort to strengthen economic sovereignty, while some governments, investors, and analysts in Western countries have expressed concerns about the direction of these policies. Understanding these reactions requires looking beyond headlines and examining the interests involved. One concern frequently raised is that increasing state participation in the mining sector could reduce investor confidence. Mining projects require substantial long-term capital, advanced technology, and technical expertise. Some observers argue that rapid regulatory changes or greater government involvement may create uncertainty, making international companies more cautious when considering future investments. Others question whether expanding public control over strategic mining assets could reduce operational efficiency if state institutions are not equipped with strong technical management and transparent governance. These concerns are not unique to Burkina Faso. Similar debates have accompanied mining reforms in many resource-rich countries around the world. Another point of criticism involves Burkina Faso's broader geopolitical shift. As the country pursues greater economic independence and diversifies its international partnerships, some Western commentators interpret these developments as a challenge to long-established political and commercial relationships in the region. This has contributed to a wider debate extending beyond mining into questions of diplomacy, security, and economic influence across the Sahel. However, it is equally important to recognize that Burkina Faso's leadership maintains it is not seeking to exclude foreign investors. Government officials have repeatedly emphasized that international companies remain welcome, provided cooperation is based on fairer distribution of benefits and stronger contributions to national development. From this perspective, the objective is not isolation, but renegotiation. Ultimately, the discussion reflects two different visions of resource management. One prioritizes maintaining a stable investment climate under existing arrangements. The other argues that countries rich in natural resources should gradually capture a larger share of the value generated by those resources. The success or failure of Burkina Faso's approach will depend less on political rhetoric and more on whether these reforms produce transparent governance, sustained investment, economic growth, and measurable improvements in the lives of its citizens. The debate surrounding Burkina Faso's mining reforms ultimately raises a broader question that extends far beyond one country. Who should benefit the most from Africa's natural resources? Should mineral wealth primarily generate profits for international markets? Or should it become the foundation for national development within the countries where those resources are found? Supporters of Burkina Faso's reforms argue that the government is exercising a sovereign right shared by every independent nation. Just as countries establish tax policies, regulate strategic industries, and manage public finances according to national priorities, they also have the right to determine how revenues from natural resources are used. In this view, creating a sovereign mining fund is not a rejection of international cooperation. It is an effort to ensure that cooperation produces more balanced outcomes. At the same time, experience from around the world demonstrates that simply increasing state control does not automatically guarantee prosperity. Successful resource-rich nations have generally combined strong institutions, transparent financial management, independent oversight, and disciplined long-term investment. Without these elements, even the most ambitious reforms can fail to deliver meaningful improvements for ordinary citizens. This is perhaps the most important lesson for Burkina Faso and for other African countries considering similar strategies. Natural resources alone do not create development. Sound governance transforms natural wealth into lasting prosperity. Every dollar saved must be invested wisely. Every infrastructure project must generate measurable economic value. Every public institution must earn the confidence of both citizens and responsible investors. For the rest of Africa, Burkina Faso's experience may become an important case study. If the National Mining Sovereign Fund succeeds in financing modern infrastructure, expanding industry, creating skilled employment, and improving living standards, other nations may study its model closely. If challenges emerge, they will provide equally valuable lessons about the importance of transparency, accountability, and effective public administration. Ultimately, the future of Africa's mineral wealth will not be decided by the quantity of gold beneath the ground. It will be determined by the quality of the institutions responsible for managing that wealth, the wisdom of the investments they choose, and the commitment to ensuring that future generations inherit stronger economies rather than simply exhausted natural resources. Burkina Faso now stands at an important crossroads. The creation of the National Mining Sovereign Fund is more than a new financial instrument. It represents a long-term vision that seeks to transform the country's extraordinary mineral wealth into lasting national prosperity. Whether this vision ultimately succeeds will depend not only on the quantity of gold produced, but also on the quality of leadership, institutions, and public investment that guide these resources toward meaningful development. The road ahead will not be without challenges. Commodity prices will continue to fluctuate. Global markets will evolve, and international investors will carefully observe every policy decision. Building modern infrastructure, expanding domestic industries, and strengthening technical capacity require patience, transparency, and disciplined management over many years. No sovereign fund, regardless of its size, can replace good governance or sound economic planning. Yet Burkina Faso has chosen to ask a different question from the one that shaped much of its past. Instead of asking how much gold can be exported each year, the country is increasingly asking how much national progress that gold can create. If mining revenues become highways linking rural communities to major markets, reliable electricity powering factories, clean water supporting families, and industrial facilities employing thousands of skilled workers, then the country's natural resources will have achieved a far greater purpose than simply generating export statistics. The experience of Burkina Faso may also inspire broader conversations across Africa. Many nations possess abundant natural resources, but the challenge remains the same everywhere. How can those resources finance long-term development instead of temporary prosperity? How can governments attract investment while ensuring that citizens receive a fair share of the wealth generated beneath their own soil? These questions will continue shaping the continent's future for decades to come. Whether one views these reforms with optimism or caution, they undeniably represent one of the most closely watched economic experiments in contemporary Africa. For advocates of Pan-Africanism, the story of Burkina Faso and Captain Ibrahim Traore reflects a growing determination to strengthen economic self-reliance. As debates continue within the African Union and across the Africa New landscape, one message remains clear: the future of Ibrahim Traore's vision will ultimately be measured not by political slogans, but by the lasting prosperity it delivers to the people of Burkina Faso. If you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe to the channel. Share this video with others interested in Africa's economic transformation, and join us as we continue exploring the remarkable changes unfolding across the continent. For decades, Burkina Faso watched billions of dollars in gold leave its soil, while much of the country remained trapped in poverty. Foreign mining corporations controlled the richest gold fields, exported enormous profits overseas, and left behind a nation still struggling with weak infrastructure, unemployment, and insecurity. It was one of Africa's most painful contradictions, a country rich in natural wealth, yet unable to fully benefit from it. Now, that system is being challenged by one man who has become one of the most controversial and talked about leaders in Africa today. Captain Ibrahim Traore is attempting something many previous governments never seriously tried. He wants Burkina Faso's gold to serve Burkina Faso first. Under Traore's military administration, The government has expanded state ownership in strategic mines, tightened mining laws, increased local control, and pushed foreign companies out of positions they dominated for decades. Supporters call it an economic revolution. Critics call it dangerous resource nationalism. But whether the world likes it or not, Burkina Faso is rewriting the rules of who controls African wealth. At the same time, the country remains locked in a brutal conflict against armed extremist groups across the Sahel. For Traore, gold is no longer just an export commodity. It has become a weapon of economic survival and national sovereignty. And what is happening in Burkina Faso may not stay in Burkina Faso. Across Africa, more governments are beginning to ask the same question. Who should truly benefit from Africa's resources? If you want to understand where Africa's future may be heading next, this is a story you cannot afford to ignore. Before Ibrahim Traore came to power, Burkina Faso's gold industry was dominated by foreign corporations for decades. International mining companies from Canada, Australia, and Europe controlled some of the country's most productive gold mines, while billions of dollars in profits flowed out of the nation every year. Meanwhile, many communities living near the mines still struggled with poverty, poor roads, weak healthcare systems, and limited economic opportunity. To many people inside Burkina Faso, it created a painful reality. The country was rich underground, but poor above it. Gold eventually became Burkina Faso's largest export. Yet, despite producing huge amounts of gold, the average citizen saw very little change in daily life. Foreign firms often handled the extraction, transportation, refining, and export process, while local participation remained limited. In many cases, Burkina Faso received taxes and royalties, but the larger share of long-term profits stayed in foreign hands. This model was defended by international investors, who argued they provided technology, expertise, security, and financing that Burkina Faso could not easily provide on its own. But critics inside Africa increasingly viewed the system differently. Many believed it resembled a modern version of economic dependency, where African nations supplied raw materials while outside powers captured most of the wealth. That frustration slowly grew across the Sahel. In Burkina Faso, people began asking difficult questions. How could a country produce so much gold while millions still lacked electricity and jobs? Why were foreign corporations becoming wealthier while local communities remained underdeveloped? By the time Ibrahim Traore emerged as the country's new military leader, anger toward the old mining system had already become deeply rooted. He did not create the frustration. He inherited it. But unlike previous governments, Traore decided to turn that frustration into political action. For many of his supporters, the battle over gold was no longer only about economics. It was about dignity, sovereignty, and who truly owned Burkina Faso's future. When Ibrahim Traore seized power in 2022, many outside observers focused on the military dimension of his leadership. But inside Burkina Faso, another transformation was beginning to take shape. Traore was preparing to challenge the economic structure that had controlled the country's gold industry for decades. His government moved quickly to increase state authority over strategic mining assets. New mining reforms expanded government participation in major gold projects, while local investors gained larger ownership stakes in industrial mines. Reports indicated that 6 of Burkina Faso's 15 active industrial gold mines had shifted into majority Burkinab ownership. 3 of them reportedly came under direct state control. That change was historic. Before Traore's administration, only 1 industrial gold mine in the country had been controlled by a local company. In just a few years, the balance of power inside Burkina Faso's mining sector began to shift dramatically away from foreign corporations. Traore framed the issue in simple but powerful language. Burkina Faso's gold, he argued, should first benefit Burkina Faso's people. That message resonated deeply across a population exhausted by insecurity, poverty, and decades of economic frustration. Supporters viewed the reforms as the beginning of a new era of economic sovereignty. To them, Traore was not simply changing mining contracts. He was attempting to dismantle an entire system that allowed African resources to enrich outside powers, while local populations remained dependent and vulnerable. The government also tightened mining regulations, increased state participation requirements, and pushed for greater local involvement in production and logistics. Foreign companies began facing stricter oversight and growing political pressure. Critics warned that these moves could scare away investment and weaken confidence in Burkina Faso's economy. But Traore's supporters responded with a different question. If the previous system was truly working, why did one of Africa's most resource-rich nations remain trapped in crisis? For many Burkinabe citizens, the gold industry was no longer just about business. It had become a symbol of national control, pride, and independence. Traore's strategy was never only about taking control of gold mines. The larger goal was to keep more of the gold profits inside Burkina Faso instead of allowing billions of dollars to leave the country every year. To support that vision, the government reportedly began building a state-backed investment structure known as Sinaiji, a name that translates roughly to preparing for tomorrow. The idea behind the project was straightforward but ambitious. When global gold prices rise, the state would save and reinvest part of the profits rather than immediately spending everything on short-term needs. According to government officials, the money could be directed into roads, electricity systems, industrial facilities, and national infrastructure projects. Burkina Faso also hopes to strengthen local manufacturing capacity and reduce dependence on imported goods over time. For decades, many African countries exported raw materials while importing finished products from abroad. Gold left Africa. Wealth often followed, but industrial capacity remained weak. Traore's supporters argue that Burkina Faso must break that cycle if it wants real economic independence. The government's mining reforms are therefore connected to a much larger economic vision. Gold is being treated not only as a source of export revenue, but also as the foundation for national reconstruction. Officials believe that if resource profits remain inside the country, Burkina Faso could gradually build stronger institutions, stronger industries, and eventually a stronger middle class. At the same time, rising global gold prices have made this strategy even more important. Every increase in the value of gold potentially means more money for infrastructure, public investment, and state development. Supporters describe this as one of the boldest economic experiments in modern Sahel history. Critics remain skeptical and question whether the government can manage such large financial resources effectively, but for many ordinary citizens, the central message is simple. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso is attempting to use its gold wealth to build Burkina Faso itself. While Burkina Faso was restructuring its gold industry, the country was also fighting one of the most dangerous security crises in Africa. Armed extremist groups linked to regional insurgencies continued attacking villages, military positions, and transportation routes across the Sahel. Entire communities were displaced, thousands of civilians were killed, and large parts of the country remained unstable. For Ibrahim Traore's government, this changed the meaning of gold completely. Gold was no longer just a valuable export. It became a financial lifeline for national survival. The government needed money to pay soldiers, secure mining regions, purchase military equipment, and maintain state operations during a prolonged conflict. In this environment, every ounce of gold carried strategic importance. Control over mining revenue meant control over the country's ability to defend itself. At the same time, Burkina Faso dramatically increased gold production. Reports suggested the country produced a record 94 tons of gold in 2025, a major rise from previous years. Government officials credited tighter state oversight, stronger mining reforms, and more aggressive crackdowns on gold smuggling networks. For years, large quantities of gold reportedly disappeared through illegal trade routes crossing neighboring borders. That meant lost tax revenue and billions of dollars escaping state control. Under Traore's administration, security forces increased efforts to monitor transportation routes and reduce illegal exports. Supporters argue that these measures are helping Burkina Faso recover wealth that previously vanished outside official systems. Critics warn that conflict and instability still threaten long-term mining operations. Both sides agree on one reality. Gold now sits at the center of Burkina Faso's future. This is why Traore often presents the mining sector as part of a larger national struggle. In his view, economic sovereignty and military survival cannot be separated. Without control over resources, Burkina Faso may never have the financial strength needed to stabilize the country and rebuild after years of violence. As Burkina Faso pushed deeper into resource nationalism, reactions from Western governments, international investors, and foreign mining corporations became increasingly tense. For decades, global mining companies operated across Africa under systems that gave them major influence over extraction, exports, and long-term profits. Now, leaders like Ibrahim Traore are challenging that structure directly. Foreign investors worry that Burkina Faso's policies could create uncertainty throughout Africa's mining sector. Nationalization fears, changing regulations, and stronger state intervention make international companies nervous about long-term investments worth billions of dollars. Some firms fear that if Burkina Faso's strategy succeeds, other African governments may attempt similar reforms. That possibility could reshape the balance of power across global mining markets. Critics also argue that Burkina Faso may lack the technical expertise, infrastructure, and financial transparency required to manage large mining operations efficiently without heavy foreign involvement. Others warn that political instability and ongoing conflict could scare away international capital at a time when the country still needs outside investment. But supporters of Traore answer those criticisms with a different argument. They ask why Burkina Faso remained poor after decades of foreign-dominated mining. If the old system was truly fair and effective, why did many mining communities still lack roads, electricity, clean water, and economic opportunity? To Traore's supporters, this is not simply a debate about business climate. It is a debate about sovereignty itself. They believe African nations should no longer export enormous wealth while remaining dependent on foreign powers economically. Still, the reality is more complicated than simple slogans. Burkina Faso cannot fully isolate itself from the global economy. The country still needs technology, equipment, financing, and international trade relationships. The challenge now is finding a balance between attracting investment and protecting national control over strategic resources. That balance may ultimately determine whether Traore's economic revolution becomes a lasting model for Africa or another ambitious experiment that struggles under pressure from both inside and outside the continent. What Ibrahim Traore is doing in Burkina Faso has become much bigger than a mining policy. Across Africa, many people now see him as the symbol of a new generation demanding stronger control over African resources and African wealth. Supporters often compare Traore to Thomas Sankara because both leaders speak about sovereignty, self-reliance, and economic independence. Instead of presenting gold as only a business issue, Captain Ibrahim Traore has turned it into a national symbol tied to dignity and survival. That message has spread quickly across Pan-African communities and social media platforms. Many young Africans believe their countries remained poor for too long, while foreign companies benefited from Africa's gold, oil, uranium, and minerals. Traore's rise has forced many people to ask a difficult question. Who truly owns Africa's wealth? For supporters, Burkina Faso is attempting to break an old system where African nations exported raw resources while outside powers captured most of the profits. Whether Traore succeeds or fails, many believe he has already changed the political conversation across the continent. Still, the challenges facing Burkina Faso remain enormous. The country continues fighting insecurity, economic pressure, and limited industrial capacity. Resource control alone cannot guarantee prosperity. Burkina Faso will still need strong institutions, transparency, infrastructure, and long-term economic planning. Even so, Ibrahim Traore has already become one of the most influential political figures in modern Africa. His government has transformed gold into a symbol of Pan-Africanism, sovereignty, and economic resistance. Today, Burkina Faso stands at the center of a growing continental debate about ownership, independence, and Africa's new economic future. Many within the African Union now understand that the future of the continent may depend on whether African nations can control not only their borders, but also the resources beneath their soil. And for many supporters across Africa, that future may already be beginning in Burkina Faso with Ibrahim Traore. For years, Captain Ibrahim Traore has been known as the leader standing at the center of Burkina Faso's fight against terrorism. His name has often been associated with military operations, national security, and the effort to restore stability across the country. But in 2026, a different kind of battle is beginning to attract attention. This new battle is not being fought with weapons. It is being fought with knowledge, savings, investment, and economic participation. The Second International African Stock Exchange Fair, known as CBE 2026, has introduced a conversation that goes far beyond finance. At the heart of the event is a simple but powerful question. Who should finance the future of Burkina Faso foreign institutions and outside investors? Or the people of Burkina Faso themselves? Supporters of this vision believe that true sovereignty extends beyond national borders. They argue that a country cannot be fully independent if it depends heavily on external funding to build its future. This is why CBE 2026 has attracted attention as more than a financial gathering. For many observers, it represents a new front in the broader struggle for economic sovereignty. If you enjoy learning about the major transformations shaping Africa today, make sure to subscribe to the channel and follow our future reports. To understand why this idea is gaining momentum, it is important to look at the challenges facing Burkina Faso. Since 2022, the country has devoted significant resources to security and reconstruction efforts. These priorities require substantial funding, yet military victories alone cannot guarantee long-term independence. A nation may secure its territory while remaining financially dependent on others. This reality has led to growing discussions about economic sovereignty, where protecting national interests means not only defending land, but also strengthening the ability to finance development through domestic resources and citizen participation. CBE 2026 was presented under a simple but highly strategic theme: financial markets and financial inclusion. The central question was equally straightforward. How can the stock market be brought closer to ordinary people? For decades, financial markets across much of Africa have often been viewed as spaces reserved for wealthy investors, large corporations, and financial professionals. Many citizens have never owned a share, purchased a bond, or participated in any formal investment activity. As a result, millions of people save money without ever becoming part of the broader economic growth that their savings could help create. This is precisely the challenge that CBE 2026 seeks to address. According to the organizers, the objective is not merely to promote stock exchanges. It is to change perceptions. The event aims to demonstrate that investment opportunities should not be limited to a privileged few. Instead, financial participation should be accessible to students preparing for their future, farmers seeking greater financial security, market traders building small businesses, and workers hoping to create long-term wealth for their families. This represents a significant shift in thinking. Rather than focusing exclusively on attracting foreign investors, the discussion increasingly centers on empowering domestic investors. The goal is to help citizens understand how financial markets work and how they can participate responsibly. For supporters of this approach, every citizen who learns to invest becomes more than a saver. That person becomes a contributor to national development. Small investments, when multiplied across thousands or even millions of people, can help finance businesses, infrastructure projects, and economic growth. In this sense, SIB, a 2026, is more than a financial exhibition. It is an effort to democratize investment and transform ordinary citizens into active participants in building Burkina Faso's economic future. One of the most important ideas behind Burkina Faso's emerging economic strategy is the belief that savings should not remain idle. Across Africa, millions of people save money every month. They put aside small amounts from salaries, business income, farming activities, or family support. Yet, much of this money never reaches the productive sectors of the economy. This creates a significant gap between personal savings and national development. Supporters of financial inclusion argue that when savings are transformed into investments, they become a powerful engine for growth. Instead of remaining inactive, these resources can help finance roads, energy projects, housing developments, schools, and businesses that create jobs. This philosophy is visible in Burkina Faso's recent efforts to mobilize resources from its citizens and its diaspora. One notable example is the Diaspora Bonds Initiative, which seeks to encourage Burkinabe living abroad to contribute directly to national development through structured investment programs. Rather than relying exclusively on external lenders, the country is exploring ways to channel the commitment and financial capacity of its own people. The significance of this approach extends beyond the amount of money raised. It represents a different vision of development. A worker living overseas is no longer viewed simply as someone sending money home to relatives. That individual can also become an investor in national infrastructure and economic transformation. Even relatively small investments can have meaningful collective impact when participation becomes widespread. Thousands of citizens contributing modest amounts may ultimately generate resources capable of supporting major development projects. For advocates of economic sovereignty, this is where the real power lies. National development becomes a shared responsibility rather than a process driven primarily by foreign capital. In that sense, every saver has the potential to become a nation builder, and every investment can become a contribution to the future of Burkina Faso. Many experts believe that financial education may be the most important element of any long-term strategy for economic sovereignty. A country can create investment opportunities, launch financial programs, and encourage citizen participation. However, if people do not understand how money works, these efforts will have limited impact. This challenge is not unique to Burkina Faso. Across many countries, people spend years studying mathematics, history, science, and literature without ever receiving practical education about savings, investing, risk management, or wealth creation. As adults, they are expected to make important financial decisions despite having little formal preparation. This is one reason why discussions at SIBA 2026 have extended beyond stock markets and investment products. There is growing interest in promoting financial literacy among younger generations and introducing financial education into schools and universities. The goal is not to turn every student into a stock trader. Instead, It is to help future citizens understand fundamental concepts that can improve their economic security. Learning how investments work, understanding the relationship between risk and return, and recognizing the importance of long-term planning can empower individuals throughout their lives. For young entrepreneurs, financial knowledge can improve business decisions. For workers, it can support retirement planning. For families, it can help build greater stability across generations. Supporters of this approach argue that economic development begins with informed citizens. Roads, factories, and infrastructure remain important, but human knowledge is equally valuable. A population that understands finance is better equipped